Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing an aspect of the immigration crisis that's not being discussed, as all the oxygen in the room is being taken up with whether or not to have a border wall. But retired immigration judge Paul Schmidt says that if we don't solve the backlog and the crisis taking place in our immigration courts, we're going to have a civil rights disaster in this country. Judge Schmidt really knows this issue, having spent about 15 years as an immigration judge. He also worked for the Immigration and Naturalization Service as the general counsel. That's the predecessor to ICE. And he worked on the last big immigration reform bill to make it through Congress all the way back in 1986. Judge Schmidt has a passionate, informed, and very disturbing perspective on what's happening in the immigration courts of our country. Stay tuned for this important discussion. Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about an aspect of the immigration debate that isn't being talked about at all and really needs to be. And that's what's going on and really what's not going on in our immigration courts, the pileup in our courts, and really the injustice that results from that. And to help us understand this issue and why there's a lot more to the immigration debate today than the narrow question of a border wall, is retired immigration judge Paul Schmidt. So first of all, Judge Schmidt, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
My pleasure, Aaron. Thank you so much for inviting me.
This issue, Judge, I know is something you've spoken about and you've written about. I wonder if you could give us sort of the headline of what the issue is. And then I want to understand your own background a little bit, and then we'll dive into it in more depth.
It's a due process crisis in immigration court with a totally uncontrolled backlog and absolutely appalling mismanagement of the whole system by this administration. I don't know if folks know, but the immigration court is only sort of a court in name only. It's actually a captive court within the executive branch run by the Justice Department. And, as you know from our last Attorney General, who was an outspoken xenophobe and anti-immigrant zealot, it's impossible for a prosecutorial agency like the Department of Justice to fairly administer a real court system. So the whole thing has become a joke, a bad joke, I might say.
Well, and this is something you can very expertly help us understand as a person who served on that court for 13 years. Give us a little bit of your own background, Judge, and then we'll dive into this and try to unpack the problem.
Well, my last government job, I was the United States immigration judge at the Arlington Immigration Court for 13 years until I retired in June of 2016. Prior to that, I was a member of the Board of Immigration Appeals, an appellate immigration judge, and I was chairman of the board. I was on the board for 8 years. I was chairman of the board for 6 years. Mm-hmm. And then before that, I ran the Washington office of the immigration firm Fragaman. I also was a partner at the practicing business immigration at the worldwide law firm Jones Day. And before that, I was the deputy general counsel and the acting general counsel for a time of what we call the legacy INS during the late 70s up till 1987. And then I started my career as a staff attorney at the Board of Immigration Appeals back in 1973. So I've been at this in one form or another for 4 decades. I'm an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law, and I also have taught at George Mason Law.
And one of the last things, as I understand it, Judge Schmidt, that you worked on at the former Immigration and Naturalization Service was the last big piece of immigration reform legislation that Congress was, the Congress managed to get together on and pass, and that was in 1986.
Yes, IRCA.
IRCA, right. Now, this issue, we've been hearing about immigration and all of the talk during the 2016 campaign. Now President Trump promised a magnificent wall on the border that Mexico would pay for, and now negotiations over his demand for $5+ billion to build that wall have caused us to experience a massive shutdown of the federal government. And so much of the debate and discussion has been about the wall. Is it a 2,000-mile wall? Is it a partial wall? Is it steel? Is it concrete? I mean, all these different conversations. But it seems like one of the real issues that's going on in the world of immigration, and one of the great crises that we're facing in immigration, is the crisis of immigration and the problems we're seeing in the courts. And you worked on that court for so many years. What is the crisis in the immigration courts? Let's start with that to understand the issue that we're facing.
Well, the crisis right now is, of course, the administration. Although they claim they're concerned about immigration enforcement, they've shut down. They basically shut down the immigration courts, except for a very small number of detained cases. So there's, depending on how you count it, there's either 800,000 some cases or 1.1 million cases waiting to be heard, and that backlog is growing. Cases, I think about 42,000 cases had been canceled as of January 11th. By the end of this month, most people think at least 100,000 cases will be canceled. That basically means, those cases don't go away. Mm-hmm. They basically get added to the end of the backlog. It's what I call aimless docket reshuffling. And that really, rather than any delaying tactics or an overload of asylum applicants, is why we have this immigration court uncontrolled backlog. It's not just this administration. Basically, mm-hmm. for the last 15 years, political officials in the Department of Justice have been basically messing with the immigration court dockets as each administration changes, or sometimes even as each attorney general changes, the priorities change. And everything that was many things that were a priority yesterday are no longer a priority, so they get shuffled to the end of the deck, and you get new priorities. But before the new priorities are complete, somebody else says, "Oh, that's the wrong one. Let's have a different priority." So the priorities never get completed, and as each administration sort of shifts priorities, all the cases that they consider to be not as high a priority get moved to the end. So you have mm-hmm. hundreds of thousands of cases that basically just get shuffled. They never get decided. And then people move, so you get changes of venue. People die, they get married, they apply for different forms of relief, they switch attorneys. All of that just creates massive docket chaos. And this administration has, mindlessly made it worse by just piling cases aimlessly. They have no particular, everything's an enforcement priority. So as you know, that means nothing is a priority. And probably the worst thing is Attorney General Sessions reached into the system to meddle by stripping judges of authority to administratively close low priority cases that the DHS was willing to take off the docket as an exercise of prosecutorial discretion. So the effect of that is, in addition to the 810,000 already pending cases that's growing, it's probably 900,000 by the time we speak. There's 300,000 cases out there that EOR says will eventually be recalendared because they were closed without authority under this bizarre ruling from the Attorney General. So what they've actually done is intentionally made the system more backlogged and less functional. It's one of the few, in almost all court systems, you have prosecutors that have some priorities. They don't prosecute every single crime. They prosecute they take the court's time with the things that they think are most important. In immigration court, it's just aimless. There's no particular prosecutorial discipline. Prosecutorial discretion has basically been eliminated. So the courts are backlogged with a lot of cases that really shouldn't be on the docket. They could be disposed of by USCIS, or they're folks that simply, as you know, they're not going anywhere. They've been here a long time. They have applications for relief, and it'll be years before those applications could be heard anyway. So why burden the docket? Obviously, at some point, we need a rational legalization program to deal with the number of people that are here without documentation. But if that number is 11 million, no court system in the world is going to process 11 million cases in the foreseeable future. So the idea that everybody who's here illegally belongs in immigration court is insane, and it's really a disservice to the system in the country. And it leads to, as you probably know from your experience, arbitrary enforcement, where people who just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time end up being thrown in immigration court, and others who may have fewer equities or even have poorer records end up never going to court at all. So it's a very arbitrary system, which leads to arbitrary and capricious enforcement, which of course we've seen over the last 2 years. I'm sure you have too.
Absolutely. Well, let's break this down so people who can really understand the kinds of situations we're talking about. So a lot of the focus of the debate today is over preventing further illegal crossings of the southern border. What does that take? Is it a wall? Is it more border patrol officers? Is it drones? But okay, there is a great issue in our country with legal immigration. First of all, I mean, people coming to this country, and this is what I've been led to understand, that a lot of what we're seeing now at the southern border are families coming from Central America who may have valid claims for asylum, which would be, if true, a basis for legal immigration to this country. And that's one of the issues that would get dealt with in an immigration court, right? The question of whether somebody has a valid claim for asylum and can stay legally in the country. That'd be part of the scope of what immigration courts do, right?
Right.
And then we have, as you mentioned, we have this issue of millions of people. We don't know exactly how many millions, but many millions of people who are already in the country without documentation. And if we're going to ever get past talking about what to do about those people, their status at some point, they're either going to be naturalized and become citizens, or receive some form of other pathway to citizenship, or they're going to be deported. And either way,
I don't think they're going to be deported. I don't think you're going to deport. I mean, that's the main fallacy here. But the idea that we're going to deport 11 million people is absurd. So
and I don't think we should, by the way, either. But I'm just saying, theoretically, I mean, if anybody were to face a deportation proceeding, that also all of those issues are issues that need to come before a court, and that's the immigration court, right?
Right.
Okay. So what you've described so far is, the chaos within the immigration courts, as you say, has been going on through at least a few administrations.
Yeah, basically since 2000, it's been pretty much out of control.
And why?
It started under the Bush administration. Well, I think
not
it's
enough
political.
Judges? Too many cases?
Well, both. I mean, the system didn't keep up. The hiring in the immigration court system didn't keep up with the increases in DHS enforcement. But you also had a lot of political meddling in the Bush 2 administration, Ashcroft cut down the board, to get rid of the more liberal members, which happened to include me. That the precipitous drop in the quality of the board decisions led to a mini rebellion in the circuit courts, which were getting work that really didn't pass professional muster, and so they started sending cases back by the truckload, in addition to writing published decisions harshly criticizing not only some of the board's decision-making, but some of the decision-making by immigration judges, because one of the things Ashcroft did was encouraged summary affirmance by the board, which meant the immigration judges' decisions went into the courts for review without any massaging by the board. And it turned out that a lot of those decisions were not quite ready for prime time. So you had a sort of a mini disaster where the system broke down. There were lots of remands. I mean, at one point, it was beyond absurd. At one point, you had, you had attorneys all over the Department of Justice. There were so many cases in the federal courts that they had to dragoon attorneys in the tax division and the lands division, in the civil rights division, who knew nothing about immigration law, to file briefs in the federal courts. And of course, the briefs weren't very good, and that teed off the federal courts too. So that was, I think, plus you lacked, I think the board, after the Ashcroft cut down, the board's decisions in favor of respondents are very few and far between, particularly in the area of asylum. They added a lot of requirements. They started taking a much harder line. So the case law became, instead of encouraging grants, in a lot of cases it could be granted, it was all about looking for ways to deny cases. And a lot of those cases came back. The federal courts reacted adversely to a lot of them, particularly in the area of credibility findings, where many cases were remanded because of inadequate adverse credibility findings. So the system started to be messed up there, but the Obama administration didn't help it much. I mean, they didn't fix any of the problems. They brought in no really new faces at the board. They failed to hire timely. Congress took a long time to provide additional judges, but once they provided them, the last administration took, I think, an average of 2 years to fill judicial positions. That's absurd. That's half a 4-year administration to fill an immigration judge position. So when this administration took over, there were already dozens of vacant positions sitting there that had never been filled by the past administration. So they didn't really do much to fix the courts or the board. They just sort of went with the flow. And then, of course, the Obama administration contributed to the problem by they overreacted to the border issue, and they prioritized all the recently arrived border cases, which forced all the other cases to the back of the queue again. But a lot of the recently arrived cases weren't ready to go. They weren't. They hadn't been fully prepared, or they were kids who needed to go to the asylum office, or it put a big workload. It broke the backs of the pro bono bar, so it was hard to find lawyers. So the lawyers needed more time to link up with the clients and prepare. So again, the whole thing has been ill thought out, but it's what happens when you have politicos who aren't judges running a system that should be run by judges. The cases were moved up because somebody in the administration thought, wow, if we run through all these asylum cases quickly and we deny a lot of them, and deport the people, that'll send a message to other people not to come. Now, of course, we all know there's no empirical proof that denying asylum and returning people has any effect on whether another wave of people come. But in any event, if you're going to do that, then you got to take off, if that's going to be the court's focus, then there's got to be a focus on getting the folks lawyers, and you basically have to take a lot of the other cases off the docket so the immigration courts can work on this priority. You just can't stick it in place of the former priorities.
So let me give
you one example.
Yeah, okay.
Before the border crisis, the so-called border crisis of 2014, the policy was to try to work on all the cases that were 5 or more years old. And actually, we were able to do that. We were on the verge of getting rid of almost all of those cases. And then all of a sudden, the word came down, no, that's no longer the priority. The priority is now juveniles, detained individuals, juveniles, who are recently arrived, and adults without children who recently arrived.
Now, are these asylum cases? Are these asylum cases?
Yeah, mostly asylum cases. So
okay.
All of a sudden, these 5 people are coming up and they say, Judge, my case is really old, and can I have an early date? And it's who cares if it's 5 years old? This isn't a priority anymore. They took a number of the judges who were working on regular dockets, put them on these priority dockets. And at one time at Arlington, out of 6 judges, there were only 2 of us working on the non-detained, non-priority docket, which was about 75 to 80% of the docket. So we had cases that had been scheduled by other judges that were sent to us on master calendar that we rescheduled. I think the day I retired, I was scheduling in, it was 2016. I think I was scheduling in 2021 or early 2022. My colleague, Judge Berman, might have been in 2023. So the whole thing was absurd. But rather than fixing the problem, this administration has made it immeasurably worse.
Well, and Judge, what you're describing and all the chaos, the shifting priorities, the lack of resources, the failure to have enough judges, the delays, all of these things result in effectively all these people continuing to stay in this country without documentation. They're either, their asylum requests are not processed. If the asylum request is not valid and not granted, they're still here because all these cases just pile up more and more. And as you pointed out earlier, because of the shutdown now, there are roughly 100,000 other cases whose hearings have now been pushed off, and that's more delay. The clog in the pipeline just grows more impacted, so to speak. And it kind of has the counter effect to what you'd think most people would agree, which is that if someone has a valid claim to be here lawfully, let that claim be processed so they can be here lawfully. And if they don't, then okay, let's take that action. But to create a system that is basically shutting down because of all these different inefficiencies, you're effectively not addressing the problem that everybody agrees is a problem that needs to be addressed in some way.
Right. I mean, I think you got to fix the court system. You can't fix the overall immigration system without giving some attention to the immigration court and fixing the immigration court. And the solution is not, like this administration claims, more summary processing, less due process. The answer is to create an independent court system that functions efficiently and provides justice. And if you did that, I think a lot more people would be granted relief. As they're granted relief, and you have a court that actually establishes favorable precedents, not just unfavorable ones. DHS would be encouraged to, not go to the mat on more cases. You'd have an efficiently run system. Could it to 11 million cases? No, but it'd have to be combined with a DHS that uses some discretion as to what cases they put in the system, and not just considering everything to be a priority, and not proceeding with some of the older cases where, for better or worse, the people are now part of the community, and they're making contributions. They have families. They're not criminals. There's no particular reason to remove them. I mean, what we're sort of moving to is you should have a system that probably services new arrivals, detained individuals, new arrivals, people with criminal records who need to be removed, and those, say who've been here less than 2 years and don't have any equities, that you could probably build a court system that could reasonably process what's coming in, and you're going to have to, and not build more backlogs, and then you're going to have to deal with the millions of people that can't really be removed, and there's no particular reason to removing them. I mean, the economy is operating at full blast. Most of them are employed. Most of them are paying taxes. If they were allowed to stay, they'd all be paying taxes. And the ones who commit crimes can be apprehended and removed through the system. So, that should be a priority. But let's focus. Everything be a priority.
Well, let's focus on what's happening at the border now, because, as you say, that.
I mean, just one more thing to weigh in this. I hate to interrupt, but
no, that's okay.
As you know, this is a court that operates in a previous century manner. It's totally unautomated. There's no electronic filing. Everything, the files are all hand files. Everything's moved by hand. Everything's, notices are handwritten. So it's very, very unnecessarily labor intensive because it doesn't have the up-to-date technology that most other high-volume courts would have. So you got to look at it in the background of everything in immigration court takes a heck of a lot longer than you think it might. And there's more, since it's all done by hand, there's a lot of opportunity for error, human error in it.
Yeah. Okay. As someone who practices law and files electronically in courts up and down state and federal, that's pretty staggering that the system is technologically so backwards, and that's really that's a resource issue. If we commit resources.
Have you ever arrived at an immigration court and had the immigration judge tell you that they don't have all the pieces of the file?
Yeah.
I mean, that happened to me.
Yeah.
Probably, if not, several times a week. I'd come in there with a 1-inch file, and I'd look over, and both parties would be sitting on 2-inch files, and I'd be thinking, what's wrong?
Yeah.
What's wrong here? Oh, Judge, we filed our trial papers 30 days ago. Don't you have them? So then I got to go back and rummage around and see if I could find them. Or I used to tell people, just to be sure, bring another copy. So if for some chance your stuff doesn't get to my file, I don't have to have them hand copied. But when everything's done by paper, and it's not that the staff is incompetent, they're just they keep getting shifted. They're told to work on entering new orders, new notices to appear instead of filing. So it's not, and the judges have no control over the staff. So.
And there's only so many hours in the day. So
that's right. I mean, the staff's working hard, but they're think of what's going to happen when they come back to work. And they're just read in Chicago here, they have 1,200 cases postponed already. How's the staff going to deal with that?
Right.
And the incoming work, which hasn't been logged in. So there's boxes of stuff that people have filed, motions, papers, motions to reopen that haven't been processed.
Well, let's put this into the context of what people are hearing about, reading about right now. We know that whether it's in in the form of a caravan, a large group of people moving across Mexico toward the border, as we know has happened, or just over time. I heard an interview recently with a border sheriff who talks about the changes that in 10, 15, 20 years ago, more of what you saw at the border were single men from Mexico coming and looking for work. And now you're seeing more families, more women and children coming from Central America with what sound like, real concerns about their safety back home, drug gangs and criminal gangs and all. These are people who are coming to the border through the lawful entry points and are collecting there in waiting areas and very poor conditions, waiting for asylum.
Right.
So
that's the administration's boneheaded metering program, where
right. So
on one hand they say people should come in at the ports of entry, but then if you come in at the port of entry, they won't process the case, and the folks have to sit in squalid conditions in Mexico. And I think that's used as a deterrent. That's supposed to be a deterrent, but of course it hasn't worked. And an important point to keep in mind is, although the administration babbles on about illegal people coming illegally, a lot of these folks, the families, they're coming to apply for asylum, which they have a perfect right to do, whether they apply at the port of entry or whether they enter at a place other than the port of entry, which of course the government's actually encouraging them to do by not processing people at ports of entry. They have a legal right to apply for asylum in this country. So to refer to them as illegal migrants really isn't appropriate. They're even the ones that enter illegally, by and large, are looking to turn themselves into the Border Patrol so they can be processed for asylum. So this really isn't a big law enforcement problem. It's a humanitarian crisis in Central America, which, of course, a rational government would think, what's sending all these people to change some of the conditions that are making these people come. Because as you know, even people who are turned down for asylum are often in real danger. It's just the danger doesn't fit the sort of arcane pockets of our asylum law. It isn't on account of a race, religion, nationality, particular social group or political opinion. But that doesn't mean they're not in danger.
Right.
And, there's a whole question of whether even people who don't qualify for asylum should really be returning these folks to situations where they might be killed.
This massive widespread dysfunction in the immigration courts, which is where any individual or family looking to come into the country legally through a grant of asylum, that's where that request would get processed. This massive dysfunction in the immigration courts, what impact is that having on these people and these families who are piling up at the border right now?
Well, it's having as you know, a couple people have been killed in Mexico. I think 2 kids who were waiting. So it has a very debilitating effect. Folks have to figure out a way to support themselves in Mexico. It's, I suppose, intended to discourage people, and some people get discouraged and go home, although some people probably get tired of waiting and enter somewhere else. And of course, we've also had some tragedies with people dying in Border Patrol custody. A few, I think, are encouraged to apply. Mexico is trying to improve its asylum system, and I think one of the things we're missing out on is our government should be investing heavily in trying to improve the Mexico asylum and asylum processing system so that more of the people might choose to stay in Mexico, and that would lessen the flow to the United States, and in addition to working with Mexico on improving conditions. And there are other countries in the Americas, who are, who do have asylum systems, are signatories to the convention, and could be encouraged to process and take more asylees. But the administration has shown very little, at least public interest in teaming up with any international efforts to actually solve the problem. Desperate people do desperate things, and as long as you have people who face a high probability of harm or death where they are, they're going to keep trying to come somewhere else, no matter how unpleasant we make it. So the idea that you can solve this just by working on our end, without looking at the sending forces and without looking at the conditions in other countries, and without some cooperation with the UNHCR and Mexico and other countries, it's absurd. Nobody who studied this problem would think that you can solve this issue just by building walls or having harsher laws or killing more people in detention. People have been dying in detention for years. That
or
really
just bellowing, go away, just hoping. Hoping
I give the people
notice.
credit. Most people coming know, one, that it's dangerous, and two, they may not be welcome, but they also know, even a small chance of saving yourself is better than staying where you are and facing certain despair, and in some cases death, harm, rape. So desperate people are willing to do desperate things. That's always been true. And again, this administration refuses to acknowledge the human forces behind the people coming from Central America.
So, Judge, wrapping up, what if we could put you in complete charge of this issue?
No. Don't think that's going to happen.
I know, but if we could, from all the different perspectives you've looked at this problem, and I'm not asking you to solve the entire immigration issue, but just the issues you've described with the courts, the inefficiency and chaos, dysfunction, and the impact that has on the counter impact, the impact that has in worsening the problem rather than in helping address the problem. What do you think the main things are that would need to be done to fix this, or at least to improve it?
Well, the first thing is we need to reestablish regular asylum processing at the ports of entry. Regular processing would encourage people to come to the ports of entry. Instead of sending military and more deportation officers, they need to hire and train more asylum officers, which, by the way, are a lot cheaper to hire and maintain than the immigration judges, who are high-end employees. Now, one thing we haven't talked about is the aside that we do. The law does deal for mass and emergent situations through something called the credible fear process. The people who come to the port of entry and express a fear of return are supposed to be referred to asylum officers who take a first cut at deciding whether they have a credible fear. It's supposed to be a very low standard. Most people pass it, but not all do, and those that don't can be summarily removed without ever going to the immigration court. The ones that are going to immigration court, I think if you had one more realistic case law setting forth some of the, establishing some of the situations where domestic violence and other cases from Central America could be granted, instead of sending people who have established credible fear directly into immigration court, those cases could be adjudicated initially by the asylum office, and the ones who qualify for asylum could again be granted without ever going to the immigration courts. Cases that are going to the immigration courts, you need to work with lawyers. There are quite a few lawyers now interested in working on pro bono asylum cases. One law firm's opened up an office near the border solely to do pro bono cases. So I think if the administration actually worked with NGOs and lawyers, you could match up people coming in and applying for asylum with lawyers. With lawyers, the folks, all the statistics show folks show up for their hearings about 100% of the time because they understand the system, actually have all the requirements explained to them, have somebody monitoring them. So, by matching people up with lawyers, you could almost guarantee appearance. Therefore, you wouldn't need all this unnecessary detention. And then if you want the cases to be processed quickly, so it's not to send the signal that everybody just comes in and waits, then I think, yes, you could make that an immigration court priority. But if you do that, then I mean, if you're going to process, say, 100,000 recently arrived cases, then you've got to take an equal number, say 100,000 off the back of the docket, cases that just aren't high priority, that the people have been here a long time, that they've established equities. Many of them are eligible to apply for cancellation of removal. They really aren't priorities, and take them off the docket to keep the docket from growing. I mean, that's been the problem. You can't, if you're gonna move everything to do a new priority, then you have to deprioritize what you're moving and take it off the docket, so you don't just keep building docket backlog. And actually, to give the Obama administration some credit, they have started to do that through a much more aggressive prosecutorial discretion program, where they were taking a lot of low priority cases off the docket. And of course, the first thing this administration did was cancel that program and go in the opposite direction. So I think you can't have the court can't do everything all at once, but it certainly could, I think, establish a system to fairly, in accordance with due process the number of newly filed asylum applicants. And the cases at the end, rather than just maintaining them, because just maintaining them on the docket creates a lot of extra work, particularly in a non-automated system. Right. The people that are paying taxes, have family, are working, aren't committing crimes, could be taken off the docket. And of course, as part of overall immigration reform, somebody's going to have to figure out what to do with those cases. But the immigration court can't solve all problems, and they can't be blamed for problems that are really either inherent in the law or have been compounded by various administrations over the years, and made immeasurably worse by this administration.
Well, and then the last thing I think
has made no attempt to understand the system.
Right. Well, then the last thing that has to happen is the Republicans and Democrats and the president have to get together and end the government shutdown, because every week, thousands and thousands of additional
I forgot step one, which would be reopen the immigration courts. And I don't know yet whether the asylum offices are working or not. I'm guessing they're at least short-staffed, if not closed. So, you're building up backlogs at every point of the system. But certainly, rather than building walls, sending the military, hiring more enforcement officers, you need to get, more asylum officers, more judges, probably more government attorneys, and a little bit of resources in there to help work with the private bar and the NGOs to get these people represented. Because I found that the thing that really helps efficiency in immigration court is when you have people that that have lawyers who understand the system, get everything prepared on time, respect the court's time, and know how to narrow down the cases with the government, and can really focus things. And sometimes, they can even give people an honest assessment if they lose their case, whether it's worth appealing or not. So I think that working hard on the representation problem would help make the immigration court overall much fairer, but also much more efficient.
Well, Judge, we've diagnosed a big part of the problem here, and I hope that the people who can make a difference are listening to some of the recommendations you have for how to address the problem. And people have a thirst for more information about this, and you should. This is such an important piece in the broader immigration puzzle. I really recommend your blog, immigrationcourtside.com. And when we post a description of this episode, Judge, I'll make sure that
I'll get it up there right away.
Yeah, we'll put
another. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just want to make sure people know. We'll put a link to that. There's so much good information, a lot of great articles, and obviously Judge Schmidt, with his background, is a real expert in all of the aspects of this issue. So. And
you'll send me a link so I can cross.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're gonna.
Another good source that I wanted to mention is my colleague Jeffrey Chase. Does his is more analytical. He takes a problem and gives it more detailed analysis. I do more of. I try and get a lot of things up there. Jeffrey works on one or two, but he has some really for people that want to understand the system and maybe want to help people in the system. I also recommend Jeffrey's work. It's very helpful, particularly for practitioners who are thinking of arguments to make or ways to analyze cases. And I republish all his stuff in my blog.
Right. Okay, that's great. Well, thank you, Judge Paul Schmidt, retired immigration judge, currently teaching law at Georgetown University Law School in Washington, D.C., and the creator of the immigrationcourtside.com blog, which, again, I recommend for a lot more information on this subject and many other aspects of the issue. Judge, thank you so much for your time and for being on Good Law, Bad Law. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks for inviting me, and due process forever. Go do new due process army. Yeah.